Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me. So algorithms are involved in more and more automated decision processes, right? They determine the music that we listen to, right? The type of news that we see on social media. They can even be used in making decisions in healthcare, and maybe especially in this corona crisis, when the hospitals are overwhelmed, who may or may not get treated at the hospital. And they're even making decisions based off of parole. So what people should be released from prison or who should stay longer. So there's lots of issues involved in this kind of proliferation of these automated decision processes, but one of them is we want to know, well, why this decision? Right? Why am I being denied medical care? Why am I being denied parole? Why am I seeing the kind of news that I see on social media on my newsfeed? And this is especially important when these models are black box, or in lots of cases, they might be opaque even to the people who make them. So the kind of claim that I want to make here, start to make, is that before we can talk about how to do explainable AI and answer this, like why this decision, we need to know what is the purpose of these explanations and explainable AI to begin with. All right, so this is the claim that I'm going to argue for a little bit today. So the talk outline is that first I'm going to talk about what I call the function approach to explanatory standards. And so kind of motivate the methodology that I'm using. I'm going to look at explanation and philosophy of science in particular as a kind of inspiration, because that's where my focus area, my training is in. And then also then look at various purposes, functions of explanations for these types of automated decisions. So very briefly of like these technical functions, commercial functions, and then certain types of social and ethical functions related to the GDPR. So first, what is this function approach to explanatory standards? So this is a type of conceptual analysis, which is a philosophical method. And you can see it nowadays in epistemology with Craig and Michael Hannon is another example. So the basic idea is that we can capture the nature and value of a concept, norm, or practice by reflecting on its function or purposes. So the question is, well, what function does X concept, norm, or practice play in society or in human endeavors? Right. So that's the question that we want to answer. And so we do this by first starting out with some hypothesis about the role that some concept has in our life or in society. And then we want to determine what the concept having this role would actually be like. So first we just start with a hypothesis, and then we determine, well, what is it like having a concept having this role? And then we examine the extent to which this concept constructed matches our everyday notion or might conflict with other types of intuitions that we have. So here's just an example, not to do with explanation, but just the concept of a good person. So what is the purpose of the concept of a good person, and how might that tell us what it means to be a good person? So first we can just start with some hypothesis. So here's the hypothesis, just throwing it out there, that the concept of a good person is just to be able to predict and control people's behavior. Right? So that's why we have this concept. So then we say, okay, well, what would having this concept actually look like if that was the purpose of it? And so if that was really the purpose of the concept, then we would only be using the concept of good person when prediction and control is possible, right? And it means that morality would be relative to the view of those who are in power, right? This is what this view would mean if that's what a good person means. So then we can say, okay, well, what is this concept? Does it match our everyday notion? Well, really, it kind of misses this point that morality has some kind of objective structure, and we want to imply it in cases where we don't have these types of prediction and control, right? So it seems like this notion of good person the purpose of it just to predict and control people's behavior isn't really the purpose of the concept, right? We want to get to something that actually highlights the objective nature of morality. So maybe perhaps a better purpose is something like provide exemplars for people to learn from and to help motivate people to be moral. Right? This is just an example of how this might work. So when we're talking about explanations, then we can apply this method there. Right? So identify the purpose of an explanation in various contexts. So especially the context we're interested in here is the algorithmic decision context. And then we want to know, well, what criteria do explanations need to have to successfully satisfy these purposes? And then we can ask whether our conclusions have any glaring mismatch of common usage and practice of the practice of giving and receiving explanations, and such that maybe we adopt the starting hypothesis or we need to revise it. So why take this kind of approach to looking at what explanations are? Is that it can show why certain concepts are important by looking at the purpose of it and the function of the concept in society. It provides a clear way to delineate criteria for success. So if we know what explanations are supposed to do, then we can measure whether explanations actually do that thing. And it can also resolve conceptual conflicts and avoid verbal disputes because we're really defining it in terms of its purpose and function. And this is especially important for doing cross-disciplinary work, right? So when you're doing cross-disciplinary work, one of the problems is that people use terms differently. And so it's hard to be able to even just pick up a paper in a different discipline and know what's going on because these terms are used differently. But if we take this type of function approach, then we can actually look for shared purposes, right, instead of shared terms. So maybe, for instance, transparency used in philosophy is used quite different than in computer science papers, but maybe there's another concept that's getting at the same function there in those computer science papers that we can then use for cross communication. So then the question is, well, what are the functions of explainable AI explanations or AI explanations? So first, as I said, since my background was first in philosophy of science, I'm going to first look there what the function of explanation is to get some inspiration. So there's a lot of work that's been going on in philosophy of science on what the nature of explanations are for a long time. And there are some basic ideas that philosophers agree with, even though there's lots that they disagree with. So the one thing that they agree with is that an explanation is a set of propositions or sentences that are an answer to a why or how question, right? And we can explain things like singular occurrences, events, patterns, or irregularities. So there are two main functions of scientific explanation. So the first is that explanations are to correctly describe relations in the world. So a kind of intrinsic or ontological function. But there's this other function of explanations as well, which is the function is supposed the explanation is supposed to enable understanding. So on the one hand, the explanation needs to correctly describe relations in the world, but it also needs to enable understanding in the person reading the explanation, say. And so because of this, there are some success criteria, what makes for a good scientific explanation. So the first thing is that since it's trying to describe relations in the world, it needs to have the right kind of structure. And so lots of philosophers argue that explanations need to be asymmetrical, right? So for example, we can't explain the length of the shadow, or always get this backwards. So we want to explain the length of the shadow, we have to do it in terms of the height of the flagpole. We can't explain the height of the flagpole in terms of the length of the shadow, right? There's a clear direction that explanations can take. The second thing that's important for a good explanation is that it needs to highlight the relevant features. Right? So for example, if we want to know why this artificial plant isn't growing, right, we shouldn't be talking about the fact that I haven't watered it in days. Right? So I haven't watered this plant in a year, but that has no relevance to why this artificial plant isn't growing, because it's not growing, namely because it's artificial. Right? It has nothing to do whether or not I watered the plant. So that even though it's true I haven't watered it, right, it has no relevance to the explanation why this fake plant isn't growing. Also, it needs to be truth conducive, right? It can't have false information in the explanation. And lastly, we need to enable what philosophers call cognitive control, which is necessarily understanding. So what understanding consists in is being able to answer what if things had been different questions. Right? So having an explanation means that there's a certain set of questions that you can answer about the phenomena, and that gives you a type of cognitive control over the subject matter. Right? So an explanation is supposed to be able to be such that you can answer nearby what if things had been different questions. So if we go back to the main steps for this function approach, so identify the purpose of explanation in various contexts. Right? In the scientific explanation context, we have describe the world, enable understanding. What criteria do these explanations need to have? They need to be truth conducive, they need to be relevant, that we need to make sure that we can have some sort of understanding or cognitive control. And then we can ask, well, is there any glaring mismatch or intuitions that this type of view can't handle? So for right now, I'm just going to say no, but of course, philosophers in science might make this story a little more complicated. Okay, so how does this all have bearing on explanations of AI or automated decisions? So first, there are various types of functions and aims that automated decisions or explanations of AI, explainable AI can have. So very briefly, there could be just these like technical aims. Right? And I think a lot of the research on explainable AI are about these kinds of technical aims, right? So these are explanations really just for developers, people who are working with these machine learning models. So explanations could then help to debug the model, to improve the model, helping developers understand how a model works in order to implement it or to use it in some other sense. Right? And if this is the aim of an explanation for how the model works, right, it's going to be quite different than if it's used in some other context, right? So if I'm not a developer, I'm not going to be able to understand these explanations. And I probably shouldn't have to understand them, right? Because they're meant for developers in these contexts. But there's also lots of other aims that explanations can have. So this is from a paper from one of my former colleagues at Delft, Nava Tintareb, about this various aims back in 2007 that was in research on explanations of these kinds of automated decisions. So I want to highlight just three in particular. So there's trust, so increase users' confidence in a system, persuasiveness, trying to convince users to try something or to buy it, and then satisfaction, so increase the usability or the enjoyment of a system or platform someone's using. So these aims of explanation in some ways are really commercial aims. I mean, they could be, they don't have to be, right? Trust could be important in non-commercial instances, for example, but they really are used in these kinds of commercial instances. So for example, just if you go on to Amazon and you want to buy a Slinky, you get all these recommendations of what to buy next. And so apparently if you're interested in Slinkies, that's really all you're interested in. So if you get to why are they recommending more Slinkies? Well, because people who buy some buy other ones, they're frequently bought together. You also get an explanation why you see these particular slinkies. The one that you can wear as a bracelet seems very interesting, right? You see these ones because they're sponsored, right? They're being paid. So that's the explanation here, right? Sponsored products. That's why you're seeing these products. And then you also see other products, right? And what's the explanation for these particular slinkies? Well, it's because that's what customers buy after viewing the item, the main item that you have in your, that you see on your screen. So if we think about these explanations of just why we're seeing these products that are made from an automated decision process, and we think of the aim of this is trust, persuasiveness, and satisfaction, right? The standard for whether or not these are good explanations really are going to be depending on that, right? If these explanations didn't actually increase users' trust or persuasiveness, right, then Amazon would change the explanation. And when they test the explanation, then they might ask questions about, well, did people actually buy these products or not, right? Or we ask people, did it increase your trust in the system or not? So we can ask, how do these commercial functions compare with the various functions of scientific explanations that I was talking about a moment ago? Well, the first thing is that the type of an intrinsic function of explaining how relations work in the world is best seen in this aim of transparency that Tinterev talks about. But this epistemic function of understanding in this commercial space is placed on really different ends, right? So the goal is not understanding the phenomenon or even how the model works at all, right? If that's the phenomenon, or understanding yourself and your interests about like buying slinkies or whatever. It's on understanding the interface, right, or the explanation itself. Right? So the explanation is then placed on this different type of end. Right? The function of the explanation is really just for the purpose of the platform in these types of commercial cases. It's not for anything else. And so that means that truth conduciveness isn't really a standard in the same way. So if the function of the explanation is just for the platform to convince you to buy something, right? It doesn't have to be true at all. It doesn't have to be true that other people actually looked at more slinkies after they bought a slinky. It could be completely false as long as it got you to buy more of a product that Amazon wanted you to buy or to increase trust. And what's relevant is then tied to, right, the success, right, of the platform, what they're trying to get. And also things aren't made explicit that users might want to know. So for example, in this explanation of why you see these products, what other items do customers buy after viewing this item? What's implicit here is that Amazon tracks users' behavior, right? And they track users' behavior in a specific type of way. But that information is hidden here. I mean, it's hidden in plain sight, but it's not really highlighting something that might be of interest to specific users who are using the platform. Okay, so what I've done so far is make a case that depending on the function of the explanation, the criteria for success are going to be quite different, and what type of thing might be included in the explanation might be quite different. And so those were commercial functions of explanations. And then there's also this whole other dimension to explanations of automated decisions, which are these like social and ethical functions of explanation. So if we move away from using explanation just in a kind of commercial sense to promote more use on a platform or to promote more buying behaviors, and move to these other types of functions, we get different criteria, again, for success. So what I want to do here is just look at the GDPR. So I'm no way a legal scholar. So what I say might not be legally binding at all, but there are some ethical norms that stand out when we look at the GDPR and the right to explanation. So I'm not going to read all this text, but there are some concepts that really stand out. Right? So the first one is profiling and processing. So the idea is that anytime an automated decision makes a significant decision about you, you have this right to explanation. And so there are certain conditions under which they're especially interested in having this right to explanation. So instances of profiling, so any form of automated processing of personal data, instances of where this is processing, so any set of operations which is performed on personal data. And a particular concern is analyzing or predicting aspects of certain natural person's performance at work, economic situation, health, preferences, interests, so on and so forth. They also talks about safeguarding rights and freedoms, which what they mean is the right to the access of the information collected, a right to meaningful information, right, about the logic involved, and to provide information in a concise, transparent, intelligible way. It also talks about the right to consent for users to express their point of view and to contest the decision of this automated process. And it shouldn't be based on special categories like ethical origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs. So all my beliefs about philosophy of science, I shouldn't be discriminated against or used in an AI system. So what we see here through all these concepts is this idea of explanations are providing or ought to give users a sense of control. So this feedback on the system, that they can contest the decision, that they have to consent to it in some sense. And these also explanations are providing a kind of oversight against discrimination, and oversight against infraction of other types of rights and freedoms. So this type of control isn't really cognitive control in the epistemic case of just providing understanding like we saw in scientific explanation, but this kind of actionable control, right? That's something that you can do something with it. So it's not just that I can understand whether or not certain things had been different, but that I can actually do something with that, right? That there's actually some aspects about it that I can contest to or consent to or provide feedback on. And we also have this idea of promoting oversight, right? So the explanation needs to make explicit that certain things are in the interest of people's rights and freedoms, right? So this is quite different from the case of scientific explanation. We're just talking about understanding the world, and it's quite different from the commercial case in which they're not concerned at all about making certain things explicit that are against people's rights and freedoms. So this type of oversight may be perhaps the explanation, a certain ad explanation on Amazon or Facebook or what have you needs to include information that people might want to know about whether or not they would be discriminated against. So if the model was using something like gender to have some ad being shown to you, then the person has, there's an ethical function of explanation there that aspect of the explanation needs to be included in why you're seeing this ad, that it was somehow based in part on gender. And that's going to conflict maybe with aims of trust in the platform, right? Maybe I won't trust Facebook anymore if I'm seeing all these ads just because of my gender. So what counts as relevant right, for the explanation changes, as I was saying. And the kinds of what if questions that must be answered also change, right? So what if they didn't have that information? What if Facebook didn't have my gender information or didn't have other types of discriminatory information about me? How would that change how the ads are being seen? So the goal here in these ethical and social explanations is that it's not understanding the phenomenon yourself or your interests or understanding the world, or even, I mean, so this broad sense of how the model works. I mean, the model works in various different ways. What is it that's relevant to you? So in the social and ethical function, it seems like, just taking the GDPR as a kind of inspiration, it's on understanding how the algorithm fits into your larger value framework, right? How does the algorithm fit into my larger value framework such that I can contest it if I want to, how I can say that it shouldn't be making decisions based on these criteria, that it shouldn't be using this type of personal data of mine to be used in the criteria, right? And if that's the function of the explanation, to be able to show people how the algorithmic decision process fits into one's larger value framework, then the types of things we need to know about the model are going to be quite different than the types of things that maybe developers just need to debug something, or the types of things that we need to know just to try to persuade somebody whether to buy something. Yeah, so to sum up here, what I've been saying is that depending on the purpose of an explanation, the norms of success are different. And there are several possible purposes or functions that AI explanations can have. And also that social and ethical explanation functions matter just as much as technical or epistemic functions. And commercial functions might actually hinder social and ethical functions of these explanations. So really what we need to do is have a larger discussion of what the purpose of or function of these AI explanations actually should be in various contexts, right? Should they be freedom preserving, or should they just be epistemic in the sense that, like, we really just need to know like the bare bones of how this works? Or does it need to create feelings of trust, right, in someone? And depending on what these purpose or functions are, that's really going to change the nature of the explanation and various research projects that we might engage in figuring out how to deal with these types of black box models. All right, that's it. Thanks.
It's super interesting. Thank you very much, Emily. That was very nice. So yeah, I think yeah, I think someone has questions. Emily, you can speak up, you can type it, or just raise your hand. I see some hands, but I think they're just clapping for you. Okay. So does someone have a question for now? If not, I can kick off a little bit. One question. I have one question for you, Emily. So I really like the framework you propose about like this differentiation regarding the purpose, and I was mostly interested on when you were talking about control. So first you mentioned about the idea from cognitive control, and then later on when you went into the GDPR, say like the difference between cognitive control and actionable control. So if you can expand this a little bit more, because so we here at AI Tech and the broader community work a lot with this concept of meaningful human control. And that's not only about like tracing the responsibility after effect, after something happens, but also how to provide this kind of explanations and information so that one can be aware of their responsibility while using this. So I think that's a very nice way. So can you expand it a little bit more? Cognitive control and actionable control, please.
Yeah, so cognitive control really just is that you have some some general idea of how things work, like in your head. So like so like the causal, like if you're talking about like scientific explanation, like why the window broke when some kid threw a baseball at the window, you really have like a sense of why that happened. And if things were different, like if the kid didn't throw a baseball but threw just a snowball or something, then the window wouldn't have broke. And when we talk about these AI decisions, you can have a sense of cognitive control about how or why the decision was made. So you might even know that type of counterfactual information. So if my data was different, my personal data was different, then I'd get a different result for this and this reason, things like this. But it doesn't mean that you can do anything with that knowledge. So the idea of actionable control is that you can actually do something with the knowledge. So the knowledge is such that you could sue the platform if you needed to. So you got the right information, that it was discriminatory, it wasn't being hidden from you. So now you can like file a lawsuit or something. Or it could be, as maybe it's like classically American to go to lawsuits, but maybe on the other extreme is just that maybe there's a way for you to update the system, for example. And so it's using some information that is just incorrect, and the explanation should give you some action that you can do. So say, okay, this is incorrect, maybe just fix this type of information, and then the decision would be better in line with reality in that sense. So you might understand everything about it, but not actually be able to have the means to do something. So that's what actionable control is trying to get at.
Thanks very much. Really clarify. And so it's not only about like the decision that are, let's say, the final decisions that have already been made, but you could think about this as a process, right? You can give a decision, an explanation, and someone could interact with this to find us more ethical and a beneficial outcome.
Yeah, and then you can even talk about like maybe it can go a bit broader too, in the sense that if you're having like a credit decision, so whether or not you're getting a mortgage or being denied a credit card or something, if all the reasons are things that are like outside of your control, right, maybe that's a bad decision system, right? So if it's only talking about things like my age and my race, things like this, right? I can't control those things. So there has to be some aspect of the decision that's in my control, right? And if not, then maybe that's infringing on my rights.
Yeah, nice. It's pretty interesting. We have a question from Evgeny. Would you ask stuff, Evgeny?
Hey, yes, Luciano. Hi, thanks very much. Hi, Emily. Thanks very much. Really interesting presentation. Really great. You're touching upon some really great questions. I'm curious. Do you think? I'm curious on your thoughts whether asking the kind of questions about explanations that you presented, whether it can help us avoid technical solutionism, AI solutionism. So what I mean is that if we determine, like you say, the purpose of explanation in the context and the corresponding criteria, can it help us realize in certain contexts that it's essential that humans are interacting with humans, that humans are the ones that are taking decisions, and algorithms are at best in the background, but maybe even not at all part of the interaction? Thanks.
Yeah, so I definitely think that explanations need to play a role here. So I really worry about cases of AI decisions running amok without any type of humans in the loop, right? I mean, just looking at like the medical case, I mean, it's really important that that we preserve the doctor-patient relationship where you can kind of give and receive reasons for certain courses of treatment. And if that's all being offloaded to some AI system where there's no explanations at all, then you really lose that important aspect of healthcare. So Yes, so I think explanations it's necessary to preserve the types of relationships that we want in society. And it might also help to have people feel more comfortable about AI entering in some way into certain areas.
Well, what I find interesting is that as I was listening to some of the things you talked about, like especially when you made the point of actually going back to the concepts, asking a fundamental question, yeah, what's the purpose? And like it makes me think in some contexts that like it can help us realize that in order to meaningfully tell a person, well, why a certain decision was taken, say, like I'm going to take a context that I'm dealing with in my work, hiring, and the use of algorithms in that context. That some of the algorithms that are out there, when they make claims of, well, based on your facial expressions, we're gonna make a judgment on your willingness to learn. Mm-hmm. Well, like I think in common everyday interaction, like many of us would find it really disturbing if one would start explaining the decision whether to hire you or not based on your facial expressions and claiming that somehow says something about your motivation to learn new things. So I'm thinking, can that be part of our ethical reflection of understanding, hey, maybe that's not maybe there's a contradiction here between the concept that we're actually working with, say, job competence, and the way we are assessing this concept.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a lot there. So the one thing is that whether or not these models are actually like tracking like the real difference makers out there. So a real difference maker for what makes you a good employee might not be what your facial expressions are in some like stilted weird interview you have online, right? So in that sense, the model isn't really getting at what is important, and explanations can help with that because it can point out, okay, maybe if this is the reason why we're not hiring this person, that's not really a good reason. So maybe we should find a different reason. So there's that, but then also it's important to know what the function of the explanation is, because if you want to explain then the decision to the person why you didn't hire them, if the purpose of that explanation is just to get them to not, get into an argument with you about it, right? Then you're going to hide the fact that you use that weird technology. You're going to explain it in some other way. But if the purpose of the explanation is to actually uphold the rights of that person, then you are going to have to be required to give that information that you used in that type of software.
Yeah, great point. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So very interesting discussion. Dave, you have a question?
I do, yeah. So firstly, thanks. That was a lovely talk. I really like how kind of digging into what the concept means can help us think through some of these things. And I think the first thing I want to pick up a bit is it feels like it's getting into a kind of a pragmatics of explanation. So it's not just about presenting the information, it's about thinking how the person is going to receive that information. And that feels really rich, and it feels like it's as well as kind of what is the explanation trying to do, it also gets into what kind of person are we trying to work with, and we see some different explanation methods. And so I guess I'm hoping that this leads into accounting for the explainee in the explanation. And then the other thing I was interested in is there's often a feeling that explanation should help people trust these systems more. And I feel like sometimes it shouldn't. It should make them trust them less. Kind of in line with Evenji's point that, sometimes the explanation should make us go, oh shit, this is not a good system.
Yeah. So I do think that we should take account of the person who you're explaining to. So I have done work with Nava and some other people on seeing if explanations can uphold some of these epistemic norms that we talked about. So like understanding and other types of goals that they might have. So you can design explanation interfaces and user studies with that specific goal in mind, and that can help you build better explanations that fit those goals. But yeah, I totally agree with you that one of the problems that I see in some of the literature in explanation computer science just on trust is that they're looking at whether or not people have feelings of trust. So a kind of like psychological explanation of, or psychological account rather, of what's happening, but they're not looking at whether or not the system is actually trustworthy, or whether people are right to trust the system. So that's a normative question. So a normative question is whether or not the system is trustworthy or people are right to trust the system. And yeah, if, especially if you look at what's going on in ad explanations on Facebook, they're not trustworthy. And if they actually pointed out the actual things that they used to deliver these ads to you, then yeah, I think a lot of people would not trust the system, and that's why they're not explaining things in that way. So one of the things that at least I would hope for in future data protection legislation is a type of regulation about the kind of information that has to be in these explanations. I mean, it has to be accurate. So if the system actually used that information, would be in there such that people could make decisions that are transparent and in line with their value system.
Yeah, great. I was struck by this when I was speaking to someone from the BBC, the British News Corporation, who said, we did a survey and we found that our users overtrust us. They put more faith in our news than we think they ought to. And that's not often, you don't often hear people say that. And it feels like explanation might help there a bit.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I think that's really cool.
Someone else has a question for Emily.
Yeah, perhaps I have a very practical question, right? So, yeah, I really like the talk, and I agree very much with the kind of more fundamental question that we have to answer regarding what we need the explanation for before we actually start working on making the system explainable. Then my question is, well, depending on the purpose of the explanation, on the overall goal, would we face fundamentally different challenging in implementing the system that we want to be explainable? Because I would imagine that if we just want to understand the inner workings of a neural network, for instance, that's one technological challenge. But if we want to kind of generate an explanation that provides control to the end user, which is a much more kind of overarching systemic question, then that would be a very different set of challenges. So is there any asymmetry in the way people do research in that or that direction? And is that linked to the technological complexities associated with different types of explanations?
Yeah, so I definitely think that what you said is right. So if we just want to know more about the system, it's going to be a completely different research project, right, than explaining to end users in a specific kind of way. I mean, whether or not, I think they do go hand in hand. I mean, so one of the research questions that I'm going to be looking at with this Vani project, and also that I've done in the past, is like, how detailed about these models do we really need to get in order to satisfy these other norms of explanation? And it might be that we don't need to know that much about how the model works, like to its nitty-gritty level, to satisfy these norms. Or it might be that we actually do need to know all the details at this nitty-gritty level, right? And if we do need to know, then we need to invest in that technical project first, I guess, right, in order to satisfy those norms. But if we don't need to know that, then it can just run in parallel, right? We don't need to wait until people make huge progress in understanding these black box models at a nitty-gritty level.
Good, thanks.
Great. Yeah, someone has a final question. If not, I do. Okay, Emily. I'm not familiar with the functions approach that you mentioned, so that seems really interesting, and that really connect a little bit with this idea from the concept of a reflective equilibrium or wide reflective equilibrium, right? Think about like what are the moral principles at stake, what are the moral judgments, and which are the background theories, I would say, things. So do you see, is there a specific connection between these two approaches? So how do you see this? Because you say about a hypothesis, I can think about a moral principle. What a concept, I can think about some background theories, and how it matches our everyday notion is a little bit about the moral judgments in my understanding. Does that make sense for you?
Yeah, so I think that they can be complementary for sure. So one of the aspects of the function approach, like the last thing, is that once you have this hypothesis of the purpose, you need to then say like, oh, does this like conflict with other intuitions I have, or the everyday notions that we have? And for that, to answer that question, you probably need some type of reflective equilibrium happening, right? So yeah, they can be complementary in that sense. So the function approach, I guess, kind of really just gives a specific structure to that process, I would say.
Yeah, okay. And it is, if I understand correctly, it's a collective process that you see that all stakeholders involved should be involved in this process, or is something more about the people that is going to receive the explanation that's most important?
Yeah, I mean, because we're talking about this like it on a more meta level, in the sense that not necessarily talking about stakeholders, but yeah, I mean, I think that in a practical case, I think it is important that all stakeholders are involved in the decision or in the process of talking about norms. But it might be that certain stakeholders should have higher weights in that discussion, right? So if you're a stakeholder that you really only care about profit, you should be part of the discussion, but it shouldn't hold as much weight as people who are being discriminated against or having their rights violated, for example.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think there's a lot to think about. So yeah, it was very interesting. So thank you very much, Emily. Thanks everyone for joining us. And yeah, so see some of you also next week. You're also invited. Yeah, of course, always welcome to join us, Emily.
Yeah, it's a great discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you. All right.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Great talk. Thank you. Bye.